So, in this episode, we're really going to be focusing in on internal conflict within our own denomination around the Black empowerment controversy. If you saw our previous episode, I'd love you to try to remember some of the tension between the Bayard Rustin's mindset about collaborative, uh, cross-racial, black and white decision making, and Malcolm X's push toward black agency. I mean, in the time of the 60s, I think the movements were kind of, at the time's language was separated between segregation and integration. I think if we fast forward to today, the similar movements are more talking about um, black agency versus uh, white stewardship over or with the black community. And that might be a simplified way of saying it, but I think it's helpful to keep that in the back of our heads as we're wrestling through what happened before and thinking to what are the things that are happening now in our denomination. And I'm going to, in this next bit, I'm going to be paraphrasing some of the things I learned from Reverend Bill Sinkford, the former UUA president, his first-hand accounts, who lived through this, who was a youth in this. I believe he has a UU World article on this somewhere, but I read it through the UU Youth Gold Mine Leadership School. I was a co-dean some years ago, and it's part of the basic curricula to train our youth leaders. And I thought that was really fitting because Reverend Sinkford was a president who was a denominational president, and he came out of the youth movement. So it's a lovely cycle through. But I'm also going to be including some personal stories of other firsthand accounts from congregants and congregational leaders at two churches I just happened to have served that were also heavily involved. First UU of Brooklyn, my ordaining church, and now my own community church of New York, whose senior ministers just happened to be on the opposite sides of the controversy. So, this was 1968, so it's a few years later, and this is right after the killing of Martin Luther King by less than 2 months. And there was a lot of violence in the days that happened after the assassination. And the denomination was moved to the General Assembly to commit $1 million to Black economic development. And the model was to be given to the Black Affairs Council, or BAC, and that they would have agency to distribute the monies as they saw fit. And this is where the controversy started. To some of the whites and to some blacks who were working toward integration, and that might be a simplified way of saying it, but there's a part of the movement that was blacks and whites together that formed through at the congregational level the Black and White Action, or what we call as BAWA. And so over a period of time, there was this real disconnect, or contention, I should say, between what was known at the time as the full back movement, full support or full agency of or full control for the Black Action Council to be able to fund and distribute those funds as they saw fit, and the movement of BAWA, Black and White Action, as seeing that as regressive, people wanting that had been working their lives to integrate saw that as a move backwards. And from the stories in my own churches that I've served, Brooklyn was very much full back, and the minister in the congregation at the time supported that, and there was some disagreements between that and members and the leadership of community church at the time that supported BAWA. And it's I don't want to simplify it by kind of comparing it to, one side is multicultural and one side is not. We're looking at a time where the question is the African American community on their own had so limited agency over access to funds, and some of the language we might use today is it's sort of those that funding would have been a form of reparations from our denomination. I mean, how did we get money off the backs of who? And I use that "we" in quotes because the Black communities are also part of the denomination. But you through a lens of the 1960s, there's a heated moment of riots and death and loss and anger and rage. That's all. The rage and anger is legitimate. And this is a way of grabbing agency again, and was given a promise. And now what was decided at the General Assembly is falling down to the congregations, and people are taking different sides. And sometimes the folks are in the same family and are taking different sides. Reverend Sinkford talks about how in that article, a public article, that it was painful because his mother was on one side and he was on the other. And there's more to that story, though, because as time goes on, it finally lands back in General Assembly, and the promise winds up becoming smaller. I think it's about 500,000. And then a year later, or 2 years later, it's learned that the then president of the denomination hadn't actually secured the funding to make that possible. So nothing was actually raised at the time. Heartbreaking. So you have all this years of struggle, sometimes between families, often between congregations, sometimes within congregations, and then nothing happens of it. And it's another moment in our history where, although we're on the ground in many positive and amazing ways, when it gets to finances, people get anxious and contested, and there's a fundamental question that's a difference of opinion or difference of ethic or value or mission around who gets to decide what, even though the Democratic polity had said and voted to put the money forward in a particular way. Flash forward to today, the Black Lives of UU, or Blues leadership, has a direct line toward the denomination beginning to make reparations for our past failures, which I believe 5 million is being raised and promised by the denomination for Black Lives of UUs to have direct administration of those funds for community and economic development and other uses of their wisdom. And they've already set up a affordable housing cooperative, I believe, in parts of in Black communities in areas that need the help. And so movement is happening already that I wouldn't have done without that. And so I want us to, I guess the reflection questions I have for us today, and this is complicated, and you might want to have one of your congregational leaders or religious professionals or someone that's involved in the eighth principle to help discuss this, because it takes a lot more nuance. Today in our denomination, through all our failures and the reality that we still have movements within our faith that are what I would consider what Reverend Dr. King would call the white moderate. We also have movements that are deeply committed to multicultural community, that are deeply committed to anti-racism work, that are, even the Eighth Principle Task Force is deeply committed to institutionalizing a mindset in our principles that say spiritual wholeness means a journey toward that commitment of breaking systems of oppression. That's what leads us to spiritual wholeness. And how do you see echoes for yourself or challenges yourself in the struggles we're dealing with today within our denomination, with what our denomination was dealing with in the late 60s? So one more thing to add, one of our members of this discussion here at Community Church is pointing out the reality that around the same time uh, of the Black empowerment controversy, the denomination is also dealing with financial loss around publishing the Pentagon Papers. And there's a couple of reasons why this is important. The UUA at the time is being bank records are being seized by the FBI, and there's a what's key to this, besides financial errors, is a sense of transparency in both of these stories. So when in systems of change, especially when it's struggle and around justice work, transparency can be key. And with the lack of that, people, as someone once said to me, and I forget which colleague said it, people don't like being surprised in leadership. And this is a series of surprises that are incredibly damaging to community, especially when it's tied into years of struggle that are a culmination of generations of struggle. And it can feel like just one more thing. Thank you for being here, and I hope if you want to reach out to me, you can. My email's on our website at ccny.org, or it's jgeiger, Geiger, at ccny.org. Have a great spring if you're watching this concurrently.